I was joined earlier from New York by Liberal Senator James Paterson. He's the chair of the Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security. He's been visiting the US as part of a bipartisan delegation receiving high-level security briefings. Senator Paterson, thanks for your time from New York. What's the feedback you've been receiving both in Washington and there at the UN? Is the pushback against Putin having an impact?
Kieran, it's a remarkable time to be in the United States, and of course everyone's deeply concerned about the way in which Putin and Russia have behaved towards Ukraine, but there is also some cautious optimism at the remarkably united response that the global community has presented to Russia and Putin. There's been incredible resolve about enacting the highest possible costs on Putin and his cronies to deter and dissuade him from this course of action and hopefully get them to rethink the course of action that they've embarked upon. Now, it's still early days, and of course the most important thing has been the remarkable courage and resilience of the Ukrainian people in putting up a fight. They have rallied the world to their cause by the remarkable way they have stood firm and stood up for their sovereignty and their territorial integrity.
Is there an appetite potentially to go harder if need be against Russia, and is there any prospect that we might see US troops on the ground despite what's been said by the President and others to this point?
My sense from Capitol Hill in DC, but also talking to ambassadors from a range of countries here in New York, is that there's a willingness to go harder if need be, to be firmer if need be, to go broader if need be, to keep ratcheting up those costs on Putin and those around him, those who keep him in power. However, a very clear line has been drawn in public statements and has been reiterated to us in private that the United States and its allies are not intent on putting troops on the ground in Ukraine. What they have said, though, is that they will reinforce their NATO allies and they will stand up for their Article 5 obligations under the NATO treaty, which is that any attack on a NATO member is regarded as an attack on all NATO members, and they will meet that with military force. So a very clear demarcation line has been set. But anything up until that point, I think the global community is willing to experiment with to put pressure on Putin to get him to change course.
So you spoke about the bravery of the Ukrainians. It's obviously something that's resonated in the United States and right around the world. Also, too, the bravery of the Russian opposition, which continues through protests, but also the political opposition, despite the fierce response from the dictator Putin.
I'm full of admiration for those Russians who are taking the very dangerous and courageous step to stand up to Putin. He runs a fearsome and vindictive regime that ruthlessly punishes dissidents, and to stand up against that knowing those risks is a remarkable feat of courage which the whole world should admire, and we should rally around those people. I think it's very indicative, Kieran, that Vladimir Putin has started to ban Western social media companies from Russia, including Facebook and Twitter. I think he fears the truth of the failures of his Ukraine campaign getting around in Russia, coming to the attention of the broader Russian population. And I think it is indicative of the vulnerable position he himself is in, that his position is not as secure as he has broadcast to the world, and that he does fear the Russian people more than anything else. And if they stand up to him in sufficient numbers and with sufficient strength, that could be the thing that changes the course of these terrible events.
What's the mood and the view of Putin from those that you've met, from the briefings you've had, from the security agencies right across the board? Is there a worry that he is unhinged and might not just push into NATO territory, but potentially use that nuclear option?
There's very clear consensus across civil society, the administration, Congress and here at the UN that Putin is not acting rationally. The course of action he has set his country on is an enormous strategic mistake, which could very well be the end of his reign in Russia and have a very disastrous effect on the Russian Federation. In the same way that the USSR's adventurism in Afghanistan in the late 1980s set it on its course for its internal collapse and destruction. And when you have a leader who's acting irrationally, they are very hard to predict. It is very hard to do any sort of analysis and put ourselves in his shoes and work out what he's doing next. And it is alarming that he has made those statements about putting his nuclear forces on a higher degree of readiness, although it's not actually clear what he means by that and what will actually happen by that. So the world is watching very carefully and very closely and very anxiously about what will happen next. And there is a genuine concern that he might miscalculate again by escalating further, which would have terrible consequences for the world. And really, you have to go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963 to have an equivalent danger of nuclear conflict that we have now. The West and its allies are acting very responsibly in a very restrained way, but we do have an unhinged and irrational actor here that we're dealing with.
Now, you've said that the feedback you've received from the US and the international community, those representatives you've met, is that this needs to put the world on notice, I guess, in terms of what Beijing's intentions might be when it comes to Taiwan. Is there the prospect, though, that this loss of face for Putin and blowback against Putin might make China think twice in terms of any further aggression in its own foreign policy?
We need to enact a very high cost for Putin and Russia, first and foremost for the benefit of the Ukrainian people who deserve our support. But we also need to send a message to any other authoritarian state who might be contemplating similar behaviour, China included, towards Taiwan, that if they go down that path, that they will be met with a very strong response from the international community, that we will rally quickly, that we will enact a very high cost for them too. And I hope that the lessons that China is drawing from the difficulties that Putin has encountered in Ukraine is that any plans of changing the status quo in the Taiwan Straits by force might also be more complicated than they have previously thought, and that they will respect the status quo and respect the peaceful resolution of those issues, which is the very strong position that Australia and our allies have articulated for a long time. I hope it's giving them pause for thought, but only time will tell.